We're in the book of Acts. We're in the chapter 9, and we're talking about the greatest conversion in history. Not only in history being up to until Acts chapter 9, the date, but throughout all of history, even today. So yesterday we talked about Saul. Saul was going to Damascus to go arrest individuals, bring them back to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem to try them for blasphemy of God, because they were followers of what's called the Way, which is the earliest name attached to Christians, right? To what you and I call Christianity today. They were called the Way. And it was so striking because it talked about the direction that they were going, also how they thought, how they acted. So it was really telling. So that was what he was doing on the Saul on the road to Damascus. He gets close to Damascus, and Jesus appears, blinds him, and tells him, "Why, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And then tells him, "Hey, you need to go in the city." And so that's where we find Saul. Saul's in the city of Damascus right now. He's blind. The end of verse 9 basically it says, and for 3 days he was without sight and neither ate nor drank. So he was fasting for 3 days and he couldn't see. Okay, so we're going to pick up in verse 10. So if you missed any of that, check out yesterday's Walking with Disciples. So verse 10 says this: "Now there was a disciple at Damascus named Ananias. The Lord said to him in a vision, 'Ananias.' And he said, 'Here I am, Lord.'" Interesting conversation. So who's Ananias? We know he's a disciple that lives in Damascus. More than likely, from what we can understand, Ananias was actually an individual that lived in Damascus. And I point that out. I know it says that, but this is why I'm saying that. Because remember what was happening. There was a ton of persecution in Jerusalem, and so the disciples spread out. Right? So Ananias doesn't seem like he's a transplant from Jerusalem, but rather he's actually an individual that grew up or lived in Damascus. Okay, that's why I make the difference there. So what else do we know about him? He's not an apostle, because remember, the apostles were considered the 12 disciples of Jesus. And he wasn't an elder. You know, we've kind of talked about Stephen and Philip and how they were elders, right? They had been chosen, appointed to help out with the daily distribution of food. So we've got this man that all of a sudden Ananias appears. You know, what's also interesting about Ananias is the conversation that he has with God. All right, because if you read through text a lot of times and think about yourself, right? If God all of a sudden said to you, "Hey, Ananias," or in this case, James, right? Or as we see in the Bible, when God appears, right, talks to people, a lot of times they're kind of bewildered. They're like, this is really weird. Well, this is different. I fall down, I humble myself, get on my face. But Ananias doesn't do that. All he does is, "Here I am, Lord," which reminds me of the calling of Samuel. When Samuel was a little boy and he was in the temple, and God would call Samuel. Remember, he would run to the priest, and the priest said, "I didn't call you, I didn't call you, I didn't call you." And finally, Samuel says, "Here I am, Lord, speak," right? Very similar. And so it seems like Ananias had probably heard from God before. This was not an abnormal thing for him. And he says, "Here I am, Lord." And the Lord said to him, rise and go to the street called Straight. You can preach a whole message on that. Go to the street called Straight. And by the way, the street was actually called Straight, right? So there's not this huge hidden meaning behind that. At the house of Judas, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. A couple things. So Judas, this house, it would have been probably like an inn, okay, if you want to think of it that way, right? And so it says, look for a man of Tarsus named Saul, for behold, he is praying. Now, man, I love that. I love that right there, because what do we see? Saul had just been through the most massive thing in his life, okay? And so He's on his way to Damascus, thinks he's doing everything God has called him to do, doing the right things. Jesus arrests him there and says, hey, you're persecuting me, the Christ, you're persecuting me. And he's blind, right? And so he spent the last 3 days in fasting, didn't eat and drink, and he couldn't see as well. So just put yourself in that spot just for a half a second. Think about what do you think Saul would be thinking right now? If it was me, I'm putting myself in Saul's position. I'd be thinking about Stephen right now. I'd be thinking about, man, I condemned Stephen. I'd be thinking about Jesus. Man, I was part of the Sanhedrin. I was part of the council, and we voted to execute Jesus. I'd be thinking about Peter and John, and that we beat those guys for healing people, right? I would have been thinking about all the bad that I've done, all the wrong thing. And so we find, and Jesus, as God's speaking to Ananias, he says, you're going to go to this man, this Saul from Tarsus, and you're going to find him praying. And guys, can I tell you, that's where, man, I pray that that's what God would say about you and I, that when we're in our moments, whether high moments or low moments, that he could say to people, hey, go to James's house. You're going to find him praying, right? Because I'm going to answer, and this is going to be my answer. And he says, he says that you're going to go to this house. You'll find a man from Tarsus named Saul. He's praying, and he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. Ananias's response is one that, again, I can relate to, because he says, Lord, I've heard many things about this man, how much evil he's done to your saints in Jerusalem. And here he is the authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on his name. Ananias is saying, hey, God, FYI, I don't know if you recognize this or not. This is the guy that's got orders to come arrest people like me. And you want me to go to him. But God's response in verse 15 says, but the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and children of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. He tells Ananias, I know, I understand, but he's my chosen vessel. Can I just speak to you just for a half a second, that this speaks to me so much, that when God puts an unction in me, when God tells me to go talk to somebody, it doesn't matter if they're the ugliest of the ugliest people, if they're the ones that have hurt me or tried to hurt me or tried to kill me. If God puts something in me to speak into someone's life that's going to bring them life, what he's saying is, I've chosen them. I've chosen them. It's not for you to decide, but I've chosen them. They are my chosen instrument to do my will. And by the way, he tells Ananias, I'm going to show Saul, right? this case, I'm going to show Saul everything he's going to have to put up with, all the stuff. And that's, again, that kind of gives us a hint of what God has been speaking to Ananias, or to Saul during his prayer. So Ananias not arguing with God anymore. Just FYI, we should put that one in our head, like, okay, if God says do it, do it. So Ananias departed and entered the house, and laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus has appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Two massive things here, okay? And it says that, and laying his hands on him, he said, now, how did the story start? Well, the story started with Saul going to the chief priest, right, to Caiaphas, and saying, hey, give me letters so I can lay hands on those of the way and bind them and bring them back to Jerusalem. And then God's like, hey, I'm going to show you the people that you wanted to lay your hands on. They're going to come and lay their hands on you, and you're going to receive sight. You're going to be healed. You're going to be anointed. That is our God, right? That he's going to use all things for the good for those who are called according to his plans and purpose, and those that love him. And so he's like, Saul's like, I'm going to lay hands on people in the wrong way, right? And God says, well, I'm going to show you what it's really like to lay hands. And so he takes this moment and you see Saul, murderous threats, I'm going to kill some people, I'm going to lay hands on them. And then you see God say, no, I'm going to use Ananias, and he's going to lay his hands on you, and he's going to heal you in love, right? Because that's the next part of that. It says that Ananias, after laying his hands on him, he said, Brother Saul, not Saul of Tarsus, not Saul, you Pharisee, not Saul, you murderous, evil man who's trying to kill me. God got you this time. He says, Brother Saul. Man, you're talking about a heart of immediate love, of compassion for Saul. That should speak to each and every one of us. If God's going to call us into something, he's going to use these opportunities and say, I can convert that, I can change that. And it radically changed Saul. And he says, Brother Saul, the Lord has appeared to you. He sent me to heal you. And so he lays his hands on him, and it says immediately in verse 18, and immediately something like scales fell from his eyes, and he regained his sight. Okay. And then he rose and he was baptized, and taking food, he was strengthened. Okay. Last thing. And then we'll end today. And then tomorrow we'll pick up in the story a little bit farther on Saul. But, think about sight throughout the Bible. And specifically, we're talking about Jesus talking with the Pharisees. So often he'd say, you are blind. You are spiritually blind. You don't see. And we talked about yesterday how Saul was covering his eyes from the glory of God, but he was blind. And then here it says that when Ananias laid his hands on him, things like scales fell off of his eyes. Now, can I tell you that's both physical and spiritual, that he was able to see physically now, but also spiritually. And you and I should be praying for those around us, praying for ourselves. Number one, God, remove any scales from our eyes so we can see you clearly, but also those around us, the murderous, evil individuals that are trying to threaten us, that God would remove the spiritual blinders, the scales from their eyes. So, hey, join me tomorrow. Well, like I said, we're going to continue in the book of Acts, diving into this story just a little bit more, because now we get to see what happens after Saul gets his sight back.